right, I'm going to try and keep myself awake through this, so hopefully you guys can stick with me too. Thank you all for letting me be here and talk to you today, and thank you to the Nanticoke Watershed Alliance for having this great conference. It's been wonderful. My name is Joanna Ogburn, and I run a small conservation business called JBO Conservation, and we focus on facilitating stakeholder collaborations, strategic conservation planning for initiatives, and connecting private landowners with conservation and restoration opportunities. And today I'm going to try and give you a fairly high-level overview of land conservation in the Nanticoke watershed. All right, so I don't know how many folks here are familiar with land conservation, the primary mechanisms that we use, but here in the Nanticoke for permanent land conservation work, and when I say land conservation, I mean conserving the property in its natural, its current state, and preventing further development. So two primary methods that we're using here: fee simple acquisition, which is just simply, that was a bad pun, I apologize there, but that is just simply when a conservation entity like a land trust or a state or federal agency purchases the property from a private landowner, and they maintain it into perpetuity. And then conservation easements, which is a very frequently used tool here and throughout the country. And that is where a landowner will give up some of the rights of their property, and those rights will be held by a conservation entity. And certainly with all the easements I've ever worked on, the least amount of rights that you will be giving up is development. So they're asking a landowner to give up the right to further develop your property, and in exchange, if you're going to do a donated easement, where they're going to donate the value of that right to the conservation entity, there are federal and state tax incentives. The state tax incentives here are really good in Maryland. I'm not as familiar in Delaware, but I'm sure they're good too. Or there are entities that will purchase a conservation easement from those landowners, so they will pay you for the rights that you're given up. So those are the two primary ways that we do land conservation here in the Nanticoke. And we've heard this, I think, throughout today, and I'm sure we'll hear even more about it this afternoon, but why is it important that we do land conservation here? Nanticoke River watershed, as you all know, it's an amazing place. It's got tremendous ecological, cultural, historical significance. We heard this morning from Tricia, I don't know if she's still here, but about American Indian tribes that are still in the area. We've got the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Park, Captain John Smith Trail. On the ecological side, you can see some of the accolades up there. So just a tremendous resource. Still one of the most intact watersheds, ecologically speaking, that we have in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So important place to protect and keep working. There are a lot of different players that work in land conservation here in the Nanticoke watershed, and I am sure that I have left somebody off this list, and if it is you, I apologize, and you can come up and yell at me afterwards. We've got local land trusts from the Nanticoke River Watershed Conservancy, Lower Shore Land Trust, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, Regional Land Trust, the Conservation Fund, Nature Conservancy, Chesapeake Conservancy, a number of state agencies, their natural resources agencies, as well as agricultural. So in Maryland, it's the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation. And in Delaware, I think it's Delaware Ag Lands Preservation Program is what they call it over there. We also have a number of federal agencies that are quite active here in the Nanticoke watershed. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is obviously one of those. Doing a lot of great work in and around Blackwater Refuge, as well as on the main stem of the Nanticoke, kind of right where it branches off into Marshy Hope, there's a unit there they call the Nanticoke unit, where they're working to conserve lands there, primarily through conservation easements. Let's see, National Park Service, obviously here with the National Park. U.S. Department of Agriculture, they work through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and there are a number of easements that they do through several of their programs. Forest Service is here, has done a little bit with their Forest Legacy program, and Department of Defense is even working here through the U.S. Navy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So a lot of players here, a lot of different folks working. I want to show you a few maps here just to give you an idea of where these different organizations and agencies. So this map is showing you where the U.S. Navy, where they can provide funds to help conserve lands within the Nanticoke River watershed. So the blue here is the outline of the Nanticoke watershed. I used the same boundary that is in that fantastic Nanticoke Atlas that you guys put out. So that's what you're seeing there in blue. The red outline is part of the boundary of the Atlantic Test Range, and that is an area within which all of the planes, helicopters, and drones that are being tested out of the Patuxent Naval Air Station down in southern Maryland, They all fly across the Chesapeake Bay, and they use the Nanticoke River as their flight path, which I'm seeing some people laugh. If you live here, you've probably heard these planes go by, and you can see a couple of them on the right here. I think that's an F-35C, and then Green Hornets on the bottom. I get really geeked out about the planes that they have over there. It's pretty crazy stuff. So because of that, they're obviously very interested in keeping the land beneath that airspace as rural as it is, keeping it in its current state to prevent any kind of safety, noise conflicts, or interference in their airspace. I've been told it's one of the most pristine airspaces in the country for what they do. So they very much want to keep it as it is, and they have a program at the DoD called the, holy moly. Oh, that's okay. I think it's a suggestion to get rolling, so I'll move to the next piece. No, you're okay. Anyway, Navy, you're doing a lot of good stuff. They provide funding to cover portions of conservation easements and acquisitions here. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, these are just the parcels that are actively managed and owned, I believe, by Blackwater. And I am so sorry, Matt, I could not dig up the daggone acquisition boundaries, but they're also working to conserve a much larger area along the Nanticoke unit that really runs from the border of Maryland and Delaware all the way down to Warastico Creek and a little bit up the Marshy Hope. They have a big area there, again, where they're working with landowners who are interested in doing conservation easements. So some good work happening there. Oh, thank you. Yeah, you just get me moving whenever you need to. National Park Service, they're hopeful and working to conserve lands within the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Park. You see there in orange. These green blobs I just threw up here, these are key ecological areas for each of the states. And so they partially prioritize where they're spending some of their funds based on that layer that you see there. And then there are rural legacy areas, which is a program here in Maryland, the Rural Legacy Program, where they spend program open space monies directly in areas that are primarily rural and agricultural. It's a fantastic program. It's great to partner with. Because of that, a lot of the land trusts and nonprofits working in the area, they focus their efforts within these rural legacy areas. So a lot of great work happening there as well. So a lot happening, right? A lot of partners, a lot of overlap, a lot of different funding programs we're all trying to make use of, which could very easily cause a lot of confusion, a lot of tension. But one strategy that I think has worked pretty well here in the Nanticoke watershed is the groups really do a lot of coordination and they have a lot of collaboration. They know each other fairly well, they partner frequently, and they meet a couple times each year and talk about the projects they're working on and try to help each other through some of the barriers that we're facing. So some really fantastic work happening there. And that's really enabled us to leverage dollars and make every dollar go that much further and do more acreage here in the Nanticoke watershed. It also really helps when you come across a property that just is a little bit tricky. A number of them, actually I feel like most of them are, they're kind of a puzzle, trying to find the right partners, the right money. Some monies can't match others. Some programs have funky requirements. Landowners sometimes have funky ideas. So finding the right mix of things that are gonna work, collaboration really helps you get through those tough barriers. Another strategy that's worked pretty well here in the Nanticoke to bring in some private funding is what I call fill in the gaps, which is just as it sounds, protecting those lands in between already protected areas. So you're creating corridors of conserved lands. That's really great for restoration opportunities as well. And finally, we've been very fortunate here in the Nanticoke to have fairly consistent federal and state funding, which has enabled a lot of this great work. Blackwater Wildlife Refuge has done a great job in bringing in funds from Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund, Migratory Bird Act. The state of Maryland, I think in 2018, fully funded their program open space monies, their funding. So especially in Maryland, we've had fairly consistent funding. Delaware, I believe, is also now funding the open space program. So a lot of good stuff happening right now in the Nanticoke watershed. And I should mention that a lot of groups work really hard to make sure the powers that be know about the great work happening here. And because of that coordination, we're able to have a list of properties kind of ready to roll so we can really support the continued funding of these programs. So what does it all result in? How are we? What's the progress? Best as I can tell, so this is through just a GIS analysis, pulling the layers down and taking a look. So these numbers are a little bit rough. We have about 350,000 acres conserved here in the boundary that you see, the Nanticoke River watershed and Blackwater. The green are obviously all of the protected lands. You can start to see where some of the corridors are coming together, south of south of Blackwater. Doing a lot of work between Vienna and Seaford along that portion of the Nanticoke and up the Marshy Hope as well. Those are some key areas for a lot of folks working in the Nanticoke River watershed. This makes me a little bit nervous to say again, because this was a quick GIS analysis on my part. But if these numbers are pretty close, then it's between 40 and 47% of the watershed is conserved. That doesn't mean it's all forested or wetlands. There is a lot of that. There's also a lot of agricultural land. So you're getting a mix of land use types, which is great. We're promoting working landscapes as well as natural habitat. One thing I just wanted to share that's kind of a personal interest of mine, as well as others working in the land conservation community, is that these lands offer great opportunities for restoration. Oftentimes when I'm talking with landowners to do an easement, they mention, hey, do you know how to get this frag off my property? Or I'd love to see some quail here again, or I'd really like to get more waterfowl coming through some of my ponds. So there's a lot of interest we run into, and I think there's a lot of coordination happening among the land conservation community and a lot among some of the restoration community, and trying to mix those two together a little bit more. I think we could find some wonderful collaboration opportunities. I see you guys smiling from the Lower Shore Land Trust. You're probably working on this, but anyway, fantastic opportunities for some of these conserved corridors that we've got going, and a lot of great landowners who have deep connection to the land, really care about the area, very interested in habitat and keeping the land rural. So with that, I will pass it on to the next, and Jen.
Good afternoon. My name is Jen Dindinger, and I'm a watershed restoration specialist with Maryland Sea Grant Extension. I want to thank Lisa and Beth and Evan from Nanticoke Watershed Alliance for accepting my proposal and inviting me here. And thank you all for staying and staying awake after lunch. That's always a big deal when you're here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I do in the watershed and on the lower shore generally, and what kinds of things Extension can do for you as well. So if you're not familiar with the Extension service, there's an Extension service in every state, and it is the boots on the ground and boots on the dock outreach program, usually in the College of Ag and Natural Resources or the equivalent for the land grant university within that state. So all your A&M schools, College Park is the one in Maryland that's the land grant. And the purpose of Extension originally was to take research that was being done at institutions and bring it out to the farm community, to the farmers who are actually working the land, growing the crops, to help them have a better quality of life, to have more efficient production, to conserve water, conserve nutrients. And we've expanded beyond agriculture to also include natural resources, the 4-H program, the old home economics program, which is now called Family and Consumer Sciences. So my role is in natural resources and watershed restoration. We live and work in our communities. So I live in Easton. I'm based out of Cambridge and Dorchester County, and I serve the Lower Shore. We are nonpartisans. We bring science to help people understand what solutions are available. We aren't telling you what to do with your life or with your business, but trying to provide you the tools to make those decisions. There are 5 of us who do the work that I do, and you can see where we are here around the state. We do not have a presence from the Watershed Team out in Western Maryland. That is not because we think there are no watersheds in Western Maryland, but the original source of funding for our program came from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they have a coastal zone that they work in, and Western Maryland is not part of that coastal zone. So this is a picture of the 5 of us if you're in those counties, and our sort of jargony mission statement, which actually doesn't really even talk about water quality. So we should probably look into that, but this is basically why we do the work that we do. And I think we're all here because we agree that healthy rivers and streams and watersheds and ecosystems are the point of our work. And in general, what how we do this is, as extension agents, we learn about all of this stuff and all of the things that go along with this. And then we talk to all of these people, many of whom are you in the room. And by talk to these people, I mean we do a lot of listening. So our job is to understand what the science is saying, understand what the needs on the ground are, and try to link the two. And I will say it's much harder for me to push those needs on the ground up to the agencies and the local governments than it is for me to understand what local governments and agencies want and then have to share it with communities. But that's our job, to try and facilitate that process and make it happen. And then obviously the goal is to bring everyone together and try to make sure that we're mimicking the natural water cycle, at least in the stormwater management part of the work that I do. And I would say we often joke that we are helping to save the bay one meeting at a time, but really, although we're being sort of silly, you will hear over and over in any talk that anyone gives about looking at how to get more purchase in a community or how to get more done. It's about building personal relationships and making connections and having staying power. And the only way you can do that is really to get to know people and have face-to-face meetings to at least begin the relationship. So I like to inject a lot of humor, and so this will just be one piece of this. So I'm just gonna talk very briefly about three kinds of projects that I have worked on or am beginning to work on in the Nanticoke watershed. One of which is the Cambridge Clean Water Action Plan, and both Nanticoke and Nanticoke Watershed Alliance and Chesapeake Bay Foundation invited me to participate on a group that helped advise a consultant who put together this 10-year plan for cleaning up Cambridge waters. And the role that I played in this plan was to just help advise the consultant. Two outcomes from the plan were to reduce impervious surface in Cambridge and to help folks redirect downspouts and install best management practices that would minimize stormwater pollution. And so one way that I helped to do this was to put together a survey to poll or ask homeowners in this target area, if you could put in BMPs, like what's stopping you? What's the challenge? In some of the work I do, we're learning that just because you know about a problem doesn't mean you're actually going to take the steps to solve it. We don't always act rationally or what's in our best interest or in the best interest of our neighborhood or our piece of property, and that's what social science is showing us. So we need some more tools to help us to show people how to do things. So you can see, or you can't because it made it kind of small, but the two things that people really were in need of in order to do these best management practices, even after being educated about them, were some funding and some technical assistance. For example, nobody wants to cut their downspout. You can say measure twice, cut once all day long, but when people get home, like that's just sort of a screechy metal sound too. Nobody really wants to cut the downspout. So getting some technical assistance on how to do that so that you don't have to measure twice, cut once, oops, go out and buy a whole new downspout and measure again. Those are the kinds of things that they learned through this survey. So then they were able to help install different best management practices at 5 communities. And what the part I'm describing is just the small role that I played. There was a larger grant that offered some cost share money that Nanticoke Watershed Alliance and CBF helped to manage to help homeowners install these best management practices. Oops. And the other thing I did, engineers in the room, don't worry, I'm clearly not competition, I'm not coming for your dollars, but I can do very small scale site designs that do not require under drains or massive rerouting. I know I am not an engineer, nor could I even mimic one having stayed at a Holiday Inn. So your firms are safe from my competition, but I can design a conservation landscape or a small-scale rain garden. In fact, you guys could too. plenty of online resources, but definitely ask for some help with the native plants and do your perk test and your soil test as well. I think that's it for the Cambridge one. Another project that I worked on, again, as a small piece of a very large project was this, another project funded, well, this project was funded by NOAA, and we generally call it Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience. It was a very multidisciplinary project led by some anthropologists and sociologists at University of Maryland, and the project was conducted in Dorchester, Wicomico, and Somerset counties. And the idea was in these very rural, unincorporated areas of the state, which is a lot of where we live and work, there's no one convening body like your incorporated town. But many people in these areas are part of a faith community. And it's not the only gathering place for members who live, or for residents who live out in these unincorporated rural areas. But it is one place that community members do gather. So the idea was to look at ways that local government leaders and faith leaders could learn from each other about how to communicate resilience information and how to communicate back to the local governments what the resilience and adaptation and vulnerability challenges were at the local level. And there's some really fascinating, as you can imagine, results that would come out of this. I found it interesting to observe that it was very hard for both, I'm going to say sides, even though it's not a cross battlefields kind of issue, but it was often difficult to get past the idea on both sides that the other one wasn't understanding what they needed. And so having the opportunity to do a anthropology research project around how to get folks to understand each other was great. It involved a lot, as I said, a lot of interviews, both with local government and state agency staff, but also with community leaders who are part of these churches or faith communities, and then holding group meetings where we all got together to talk about what we learned and what we were experiencing. And maybe some of this stuff will seem like common sense to you, but it is often the case that we need documented research in order to prove that techniques or approaches will work in order to then get more support either from a government or a funder to continue hosting gatherings like that. So everybody who participated found value in this collaborative learning process, which was the approach that was used in the study. Interesting from my perspective was that these rural communities that are unincorporated and sometimes like deliberately living, I don't want to say off the grid, but like out in the little necks and in the little guts, felt we needed some structure, but not the degree of structure that would bring in an incorporated town, more taxes, a mayor, things like that, but some more structure to help them receive assistance if needed and also communicate their needs back up to those who are listening. And then, as I said, there's real like philosophical, cultural, and personal differences for people when they're using language. And so even getting folks together to just have a conversation about the terms that we'll be using in our conversation so that we all understand each other moving forward. Terms like resilience and adaptation and vulnerability. I have a deep, deep, deep respect for people who live at this land-water interface. They are very resilient because literally the land is being reshaped sort of daily and constantly, and they can roll with that. I don't like when I misplace something in my house, and I have a hard time rolling with that. I can't imagine having to check a tide table to figure out when I can get out, when I have to move my kid to a house closer to the bus stop so that he or she could get on the bus stop, on the bus, because the bus won't come down the road because it's a king tide. I have a lot of respect for folks who can live in that space, and there's a lot to be gained from doing projects like this where we're communicating with each other about our needs and listening. And then the last project I'm going to talk about is the Watershed Stewards Academy. All 5 of us on the Watershed team have either run a Watershed Stewards Academy or have been involved in one. It's, we put this rain barrel in when it was snowing, which is, I guess, maybe not what I recommend, but it was our very first class project up in Cecil County, and we were just so excited to get it done that we powered through the snow. So the Watershed Stewards Academy program is very much like a Master Gardener program or a Train the Trainer program, but it's based around stormwater education. And I bring it up for the Nanticoke because I helped get the Cecil County program and the Harford County program launched, and there's been some requests and a few initial meetings about getting a program launched in Wicomico County. So I've met with Weston in the county administrator's office, and then I'll be working with some of my extension colleagues to get this program started. It's an A to Z of stormwater management, so it's for adults, and they are volunteers, amazing volunteers who spend a lot of their time learning about the issues that cause stormwater management problems and the solutions, how to write grants, how to provide education to their neighbors. They have a capstone project that they work on as a team and a class project they work on together. And the idea is that Watershed Stewards Academies can help these MS4 communities with both their public outreach and education control measure and also the public involvement and participation control measure to help get the community closer to meeting those bay restoration goals, but without, let's say, like large government expenditures on these kinds of actions. So this is a way to educate the private sector and residential homeowners in small communities to get them to do some actions on their properties and on their shared property that won't cost taxpayers much money or any money, but will help move that jurisdiction towards nutrient reductions and sediment reductions for meeting their goals. So the idea is to launch this next fall, but that means lots of meetings between now and then, because that's the best way, as we heard, by me, to make relationships and to get programs started. So if you're interested in learning more about the Stewards Academy, please come find me. I'll be here the rest of the day. And we also have some information on our website as well. So that's me.